is Rebecca Schissel-Marshall with Whole Body Upgrade, a podcast to help you get unstuck, feel better, and have more energy. Let's get started. Hello, dear friends. How are you? Welcome back to the Whole Body Upgrade podcast. I'm so glad you're here. I'm going to start by welcoming in the great directions. I want to welcome in the great direction of the East and the great direction of the South and of the West and of the North. And I welcome in the direction that is above and below and the direction that is within. I ask all of our helping and compassionate spirit guides to support us here today and the ancestors that have lived well and died well. And I ask that all of our guides that surround us, my guides and your guides, help what needs to be said, and whatever needs to be heard, and so it may be the highest benefit for all of those concerned. And I acknowledge that I am on the land of the Creek in the Cherokee, the stolen land of the Creek in the Cherokee, in what is now known as Athens, Georgia. So before we jump fully into today's episode, I'm going to ask for a favor. I am going to ask you to review this podcast. I have a goal of getting 100 reviews for this podcast. I would love to reach that goal. I would love to reach that goal by the end of the year. You're listening to this, it's November 1st. We have 2 months. I think we can do it. So I'm going to ask that you rate and review the podcast. And I hear from so many people how much this podcast is helpful to them, how much they enjoy it, how they listen. And it's supportive. And so I would love for you or to ask a friend to review it so that it can help other people find the podcast, so it can help more people. My intention with this podcast has always been to be of service. How can I help? And I love being able to put things out into the world that are helpful. So please help me to help other people. I'd love to get this podcast out to people who may need the support. So thank you for that. And this actually, strangely, leads into what I want to chat about today. I want to talk about the people who need that support. I want to talk about suffering. And this may seem kind of like a strange topic, but it's really what most of us spend our lives doing. We spend a lot of our lives swimming around in the sea of what I call suffering, right? It's all around us. It is so pervasive. And we don't even know that we're in this sea of suffering because we think that that's just how life is. We think that that's just how it's supposed to be, that it's just misery. Life is hard, right? I've heard lots of people say that. And I'm speaking from my own experience for sure. I spent a majority of my life out in that sea of suffering. I was a gold level member. If there were levels, if there were awards being given, I was there. I was so miserable. I mean, high school is miserable for a lot of people, but I remember being so miserable in high school and really up until my 30s because I thought that something was wrong. And very specifically, I thought there was something wrong with me. And I thought that everyone else was happy, but that I was doing something wrong and couldn't figure out how to be happy. That if I just found the right clothes, the right body, the right friends, the right guy, apartment, house, fill in, whatever, the right grades, then I would be happy. And you might have noticed something similar in your own life. You might think that, if you lose that 10 pounds, or if you get a new job, or move to a new city, or change your life in some way, then you'll be happy. it's actually quite common, right? This is kind of how if I do this, then. And we think the circumstance is what needs to change in order for us to be happy. Now, granted, I will say that if the circumstance is not safe, then yes, let's change the circumstance by all means. And even things that are crappy, it doesn't mean that we can't change the circumstance, but we think if then, right? If this happens, then I can be happy. And yes, we do need shelter, safety, food, right? All of those things, our basic needs need to be met. If you think about Maslow's hierarchy, right? So what I'm talking about is beyond that, right? I'm talking about this, what we see when people have had those needs met. There's this low level of dissatisfaction that most people who have their basic needs met, the safety and the shelter and the food, right? There's something that's like not quite right. You might feel discontent, dissatisfied, or you might be miserable, even though everything looks fine on the outside. You may even be considered successful, right? People may look at you and go, oh, you've got it all together. So what if that internal suffering, what if there was a way to stop that suffering? I remember very specifically when I was in my early 30s, driving with a friend. And I remember just saying to her, I don't want to suffer anymore. And I meant that in the most positive way. At that point, at that point in my life, when I said that, I meant it in the most positive way. Years before in high school, I didn't want to suffer anymore. I was very done with suffering. And it was more of a giving up. It was like, I just don't want to suffer anymore, so I can't do this anymore. At that point, when I was in high school, I thought the only way out was dying, was suicide. I thought this is it. This is what is going on. Like, this is what we've been, working so hard for, to get good grades and to add all these things so that I can get into a college. I didn't think that I wanted to keep going. And I didn't know there was another possibility. I didn't know it was possible to feel better in that moment. I didn't know it was possible to not be sad or irritated or annoyed at everyone and at life. I knew how to look good on the outside. I knew how to smile when I was supposed to smile. I knew how to make sure that my grades were up. I knew how I could, do my hair and look pretty. Some would argue that I was successful, right? And yet, on the inside, once again, I was miserable. So here's the thing. At that point, I didn't know it then. And I'm learning it now. I'm learning it so much more now, is that there was and is nothing wrong with me, right? What I didn't know then was that I just needed support. What I didn't know was that all the food I was eating, as they say in the South, bless my heart. All the things I was eating could influence my mood. Like, I didn't know that not exercising and the way I was trying to self-medicate with alcohol could contribute to the mood I was having. The food I was eating, the lack of sleep, the lack of exercise, all of that, and the excessive amounts of alcohol I drank as a teenager. Now, if you're wondering, you might be thinking, well, what about bad things happen? Yes. it is true. It is true that there is pain living in a human body, whether that be physical, emotional, mental pain. Yes. There are things that are painful that happens. There are things that are sad that happen. Yes, there are times when we are filled with grief. All of that is yes. All of it is true. One of the things that kind of woke me up as I grew up was in Buddhism, the saying that pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. Does it mean that things don't stink? No. It doesn't mean that everything gets rosy, right? Not everything is sunshine and rainbows and unicorns at that point. But does it mean that we can respond to those things differently? Yes. Yes. When we are suffering, it means that not only is there the pain, but on top of that, we've layered this other stuff on top of it, right? We humans tend to put a whole lot of suffering on top of the already existing pain, right? Losing a loved one. Yes, that is painful. I'm not saying it's not. And we tend to add on top of it an extra little dash of suffering. It is possible to just experience the pain, which most of us don't want to do anyway, right? Because that in itself is really hard. What if we didn't have to have the suffering with it? In my experience, this has made a huge difference in my life. It's freedom. So you may be thinking, well, that's great, Rebecca. How do I find some freedom and stop suffering? Well, my dear, I am so glad you asked. There are many tools to stop suffering, many tools to alleviate suffering, or to at least help reduce suffering. And believe me, I have tried most of them. I have found several that work for me. And what I've found is that sometimes different tools work at different times. So I'm just going to give you a few. And you might play around with them. You might find that it's a combination of tools that works for you. Or you might find that one tool that works for me doesn't work for you. And that's okay. Anytime I teach a mindful stress reduction class at the university at least once a year. And, I always tell them, like, I am just filling your toolbox with tools. And you can use one tool, you can use them all. It doesn't matter. Like, all I want to do is give you options so that when you're like, oh no, I am suffering, what can I do? You can open up your toolbox and see what works. For me, changing what I was eating made it so much easier and much less miserable living in my body. Anti-inflammatory foods and getting rid of refined sugar changed all of my wellness bodies, all of them, right? It was one of the big shifting points for me. It changed my physical wellness body, my mental, my emotional, my energetic, and my spiritual wellness bodies. It really was like becoming a totally different person. The other week I had to eat white rice, which I never do. I usually eat brown rice, and I couldn't have vegetables, which was miserable for me. And then I had to fast. So there were like several days leading up. I had a colonoscopy, and I felt like my teenage self again. I was so irritated. I was so annoyed. I couldn't stand anything. It was wild. And it was from the food that I was eating. I knew what was happening though, right? I knew what was happening. My blood sugar was dropping, and my familiar pattern of anger and sadness and depression, they were all settling in from just a shift in food. Another way to help with, as my son calls it, getting off the struggle bus, is mindfulness. mindfulness and awareness really shifted from suffering to not suffering. It was a core part for me. It allowed me to see this critical voice in my head that was making up stories about the past and the future, and I was believing it wholeheartedly. And believing those stories is really a surefire way to go for a nice long swim in the sea of suffering. But the more I could identify and become aware and notice that I didn't have to believe that critical voice, it was so incredibly helpful. So for you, turning your attention away from that voice, even just recognizing that that voice is there, that piece of it, and turning your attention to what's here right now. So it just could be as simple as the breath, right? Turning your attention to the sunshine coming in the window, or the feeling of what you're sitting against, right? All those pieces, turn your attention away from the voice in the head, from that critical voice. That being an observer, that watching, is a critical tool in understanding, a good kind of critical, not the critical voice kind of critical, but a good kind of critical of understanding what is happening, right? The mental wellness body, what's happening there. When you know what that voice is saying, when you're aware of it, then you can take it a next step, right? You can watch what the voice is saying, hear that critical voice, become aware of it. And then you can practice what you know to be true, right? Something different than what that voice is saying. It's like taking mindfulness a step further. So supporting yourself with a loving statement, some compassionate, kind phrase, right? Practicing that compassionate phrase where it could just be like, I see that you're trying so hard. Or, I love you no matter what, right? Those phrases, those words, again, take that awareness that you've had. I have so much to do. I am never going to get it all done, right? You can notice that. And then the phrase can be like, it's okay. What's important is that you stay well. Your health is more important than productivity, right? There are lots of different phrases, lots of different ways to work with phrases to support yourself compassionately. So this practicing a compassionate thought helps to redirect the attention, again, to the feeling that you want to have instead. If you want to feel loved, if you want to feel supported, then let's come up with a phrase that can help you feel that way. Telling yourself, oh, this is never going to work, probably doesn't feel good and probably isn't very supportive, right? So you can always think about, what would a best friend say to you? A really kind, compassionate best friend. So, turning your attention away from ruminating over what you ate or what you're going to say in the next conversation, right? Those things are not compassionate. Another way to really help shift your attention from suffering to one of non-suffering is to get into nature, right? Getting out in the sun, putting your feet on the ground, talking to a tree, right? To be present. It's another way of coming into the present moment. Presence, in the present, there's actually nothing wrong, right? In that moment, you're breathing. You're here. Now, there may be things that you want to change. There may be things that you want to make different. And, right, in this moment, there's really nothing wrong. So again, we're talking about moving the attention back to the present, moving it to something different than those critical little thoughts in the head causing all that suffering. Another way is to remove the energy or the cords, right? We've talked about energy and cords. That's another way to remove suffering. So often I find that with my clients, there's an energy or an entity or something that doesn't belong to us that needs to be removed and can lead to those negative thoughts, lead to more of that critical voice and more of the heavy emotions. Removing the energy creates space to actually feel that what's underneath, right? The pain and not the suffering. And of course, always calling in the guides, right? That's the spiritual piece. One of the books I love so much is Tosha Silver's book, Outrageous Openness. And she just will, if this is supposed to happen, let it happen. If it's not, please stop me. And there's something that removes that I have to be the one in control. I have to change this. That is so freeing, right? Spirit is there supporting you every step of the way. So those are just a few of the practices. Do they seem simple? They are. They're very simple. Are they easy? They can be, but sometimes it's hard to remember them. They're not always. And that's why I find that for myself, for my clients, for friends, right? But that's why people benefit from support wherever you find that support. An accountability buddy, a coach, a therapist, right? There's so many different ways. I know when I began this work, I wanted to be with other individuals who could support me. I wanted a guide to show me the next step. And this is the work that I do. I help people end suffering and move from exhaustion to wellness, right? That suffering can look lots of different ways. But that's kind of the bottom line that I've been coming to over and over again, is that statement of, I'm just not going to suffer anymore when I was in my 30s. Now I want to help others to know that they don't have to suffer anymore, whether that be with health, with their relationships, with their job. It's just, you don't have to suffer, right? You don't have to suffer. Okay, dear ones, I want you to know that you don't have to suffer, that you can feel better, that you can stop suffering. Thank you so much for listening. And I want you to take such good care of yourselves. Thank you. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Whole Body Upgrade. If you'd like to learn more about working with me, you can visit me on Facebook or Instagram or on my website, Centered You, that's centeredyou.com. See you on the next episode of Whole Body Upgrade.